Hi, and welcome to another episode of The Big Game Hunters. I'm Mike.
And I'm Tom. Today we're reviewing Space Cadets from Stronghold Games. But first, chit-chat.
Yep, and in today's chit-chat, we're going to be talking about game criticism. The idea that maybe there's not enough academic rigor in the way we discuss board games. We hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to Chit Chat. Today we're going to talk about game criticism, or the idea of how you talk about games, and game reviews. Today's Chit Chat is going to follow a little bit different of a format. I'm going to ask Mike some questions, and he's going to give us his thoughts. So Mike.
Yes, Tom.
We've talked at length about game reviews. I don't really have a problem with how games are reviewed online, or really the discussion of how me and my group talk about games. But you have a lot to say on the subject. So tell me, how do you and your group talk about games?
So one of the things that really irks me about when I bring a game to a group is afterward, I really want to dissect it and break it down and talk about it. I want to know what worked for them, what they thought drove the game, what didn't work, and kind of where they felt that it fell short. But I find that it's kind of hard to elicit those kind of responses. A lot of times my play group will just say that a game was fun, or that the cards screwed them, or they will talk about just kind of surface level issues like that. Mm-hmm. And I want to know more about kind of what makes the game tick, and really what made it a winner or a loser for them. So unlike other medium, I think that it's hard for people to get into it. I think unlike movies, where people were kind of willing to step into the director's chair and talk about how the plot was a little thin here, or this character's motivation was unclear. With games, they don't really have that.
What do you think it is about the difference in media that makes talking about games so hard for people?
I think maybe part of it is that games are a social experience. Every time it's going to be a little different based on the play group. So it's hard to kind of draw conclusions about the game and really separate them from the experience with the other players. I think that sometimes those get conflated. I also think that there really isn't much of a background for discussing games like in an academic sense. With movies, we have movie critics, and that's already kind of an art form unto itself. Mm-hmm. Even for sports, there are people who are paid to be sportscasters and to talk about different teams and chances of winning, and they people really get into it on the talk radio shows and things like that. But with games, nobody's paid to do these kinds of things, these kinds of reviews. We do them for fun, or at most we get a little something from YouTube. But for the most part, we're doing it just because we like games. We're doing it from the perspective of a fan rather than the perspective of a critic.
So, how would you say that influences how people talk about games? Tell us first some of the challenges that you think people might face in talking at the table setting about talking about games. So, like I said, one of the problems I don't have is that in my group we have the same conversations your group has, but we're satisfied with that. Mm-hmm. What is it that you think holds people back from looking at a game analytically like they might a movie?
Sure. I think maybe part of it is maybe unlike a movie, if I bring a game to the table, that people may see that as a reflection on me. If I bring a game to the table and I say, hey, I love this game, I've had a lot of fun with it, I'm going to teach you guys how to play it, I'm going to share it with you, we're all going to enjoy it together, I think there's a natural hesitation to then criticize it. If somebody brings me a game and teaches it to me and we play it, it's kind of hard to say, I didn't have a great time, that game didn't work for me because X, Y, Z. I think it's easier with a movie. If I go see a movie with you, I think there's less of a personal stake in it. I also think that
Well, you mentioned the director's chair with movies. What's the equivalent for a board game?
I guess it would be sort of a design perspective, but I don't know really.
Is that kind of a challenge for people to view a game as not something purely for entertainment, but in a mathematical light, or however you might want to phrase it? Sure. Is that a challenge?
Yeah, sure. I think that it is. When you're talking about a movie, there's a natural story progression. There's sort of a format that people are used to. In talking about games, because there's not that kind of academic background, people don't have a model. People don't really know what kinds of things they should be talking about with the game. They really don't know how to break it down.
So how do you think this lack of history, or this lack of a standard, influences how games are reviewed today, currently, or the last decade?
Sure. So I think it's because, as I mentioned earlier, it's really the fans who are doing the reviews, and they're doing them from a fan perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So, unlike people who are paid to review movies or paid to talk about sports, there's not a sort of formula out there, and there's not a big stake in it. So people just want to kind of share their love and their exuberance for games with other people, and that's totally understandable, and that's a lot of fun too. I love when I bring a game to the table, people really enjoy it, and we just kind of geek out about it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think because it's done from a fan perspective, people are a little bit afraid, or they just don't get into the mindset of saying, this was a successful game because, or this game, doesn't work because. I mean, there are tons of games coming out, and I think that there has to be some sort of measure. There's some sort of standard against which they're measured, just to kind of sift through the amount of content.
Mm-hmm. Well, what kinds of things would you like to see in even fan reviews? What kinds of elements are reviews missing, or even conversations? What kinds of things are missing from when we talk about games? What do we need?
Sure. So one of the reasons that I really enjoy doing our chit chat so much, our game reviews so much, is because we do give a point and counterpoint style. I really like in a review, whether written or video, when there are good and bad things mentioned about the game. I really like when there are specific flaws mentioned. We spoke in the last episode about seasons, mm-hmm. and we got into the nitty-gritty with that game. Things that came up for us when we taught it, we really, I think, were able to verbalize when we talked about what worked and didn't work in seasons. Mm-hmm. So I really want to see, personally, more reviews that are a little more balanced. I totally appreciate at the end giving it a score, saying if you liked it or not, talking about how you might have liked the theme or the art or other components like that. But I want to know what didn't work. The most important thing to me when I look at a review is, where did this game fall short for you, and what kind of pitfalls am I going to watch out for before I buy it?
Well, there you have it.
I'm going to teach you how to play Space Cadets. Now I'm going to teach you how to play Space Cadets. Space Cadets is a cooperative game that emulates being the crew of a starship, like the Enterprise on Star Trek. To win the game, the players must complete the mission objectives, which will vary from mission to mission, and will also vary with difficulty setting. The players win the game by completing those objectives and then making the successful jump. The players all lose the game as a team if the objectives are not met or their spaceship is destroyed. Space Cadets is a cooperative game that's played out in 9 phases. Some phases are carefully timed, while others are more freeform. The player who acts as the captain will be in charge of moving the hourglass down the tracks and making sure that everyone stays on task for the timed phases. The first phase is to discuss and distribute energy. In this phase, the players have exactly 3 minutes to talk about what they'd like to do in the upcoming turn. In addition, the engineer gives out energy tokens that he acquired in the previous turn. In the beginning of the game, you simply receive 12 energy tokens that the engineer will divvy up. The captain will move the hourglass along the track to count the 3 minutes. Phase 2 is when you prepare stations. This phase is not timed, and in this phase, you simply give everyone the materials they'll need to complete the action phase. In the third phase, the action phase, every player will complete their timed objectives. So, for various roles, they must complete their different objectives. I'll go over that in detail later on. In the fourth phase, resolution, you simply figure out what occurred in the previous phase. This phase isn't timed, and this is really a matter of kind of scoring your performance previously. Then, the tractor beam officer will make any tractor beam attempts. This phase works similarly to the previous action phase, and that the tractor beam officer will have exactly 30 seconds to complete his job. Then, you will fire weapons. Though the weapons officer does act in phase 3, he now acts again in phase 6 to actually launch any torpedoes that he's previously built. Phase 7 is not a timed phase, and that is simply when the enemy ships will activate and move according to the rules set up in the game. I'll go over that later on. Phase 8 is the jump phase. In this phase, the jump officer has 30 seconds to roll dice and try to complete a jump. And finally, the 9th phase of the turn is repair. This is another 30-second phase, and again, the repair officer will have 30 seconds to complete his whirl. The first roll-up is the captain. The captain is primarily in charge of keeping everyone on task during the game. The captain receives the captain's board, the hourglass, and a hand of experimental equipment cards. The captain's board is used to make sure that everyone stays on track during the turn and to carefully time the timed sections. At the beginning of the game, the captain will be able to look through a set of 8 experimental equipment cards and choose 4 that he will use throughout the game. The remaining cards are discarded. Each experimental equipment card allows the captain to, at one time during the game, use a special ability. This can be used in an emergency to really save the ship. Other than that, the captain can make a few decisions when it comes up, such as when a crew rotation happens, the captain can have final say on who has to rotate. One player will be the engineer. The engineer is in charge of distributing energy to every other section of the ship. The engineer will receive the engineering board, 16 cardboard tiles, lots of these green energy tokens, and 2 white batteries. In the first phase of the turn, the engineer will distribute energy tokens that he's accumulated from the last turn. At this time, any 2 energy tokens of one type can be transferred to 1 energy token of another type. You can do this as many times as you have energy available. Then, during the prepare phase, the engineer will draw 7 tiles at random and place them face down in front of him. Then, in the action phase, the engineer will reveal those tiles and, in 30 seconds, match up as many of the colored spheres as he can. The engineer player wants to match up half circles to form complete circles. Then, in the resolution phase, the engineering officer receives 1 energy for every sphere depicted and an additional energy for every completed sphere. Finally, the engineer can use these 2 batteries, once throughout the game each, to give an extra energy to any player. Next up is the helmsman. The helmsman is responsible for piloting the ship through the sector. The helm officer receives the helm board, a deck of standard maneuver cards, and a deck of special maneuver cards. During phase 2, the helmsman will allocate the energy he's received from the engineering officer between maneuver energy and thrust energy. For every point put into maneuver energy, the helmsman will draw 1 additional card in the next part of phase 2. For every point placed into thrust energy, the helmsman can adjust the ship's speed up or down 1 point. Then, the helmsman will draw, keeping face down, 1 card for every point of speed the ship is traveling, plus, again, 1 card for every point put into maneuvering energy. Then, during the action phase, phase 3, the helmsman will have 30 seconds to slot his standard maneuver cards and any special maneuvers he'd like to perform, which he'll have access to every turn, into the slots on the helm board. Going at different speeds makes you more or less likely to take incoming fire. Then, in the resolution phase, the ship is moved as shown by the path constructed by the helmsman in the previous phase. Next up, we have the sensor officer. The sensor officer is in charge of scanning through space to acquire targets for the weapons officer and the tractor beam officer. It's important to note that the sensor officer cannot do anything on the turn without energy from engineering. The sensor officer receives the sensor officer board, a deck of target cards, a bag with which to put various cardboard shapes, lock and super lock tokens, and finally, a cloak token. During the preparation phase, the sensor officer can pull 1 random target card from the deck for each energy received from engineering. He places the target cards under various target slots on the board. Acquiring different types of targets and performing different sensor actions requires a different number of sensor points. You acquire sensor points by successfully making all locks under a given column. For instance, locking onto a target crystal or enemy cruiser or ship of any kind requires 1 sensor point. Therefore, putting 1 target card in the appropriate slot is sufficient. 2 points can be used to upgrade a lock that you already have to a super lock. In addition, you can spend 3 sensor points to simply gain a super lock. It's important to remember that a super lock is lost at the end of the turn. In addition, the sensor officer can make a sensor scan for 1 point. When he does so, he can reveal a new sector of space that the ship has not yet entered. Or he can break an enemy lock. When he breaks an enemy lock, the enemy will no longer pursue the ship until it acquires a new lock. Finally, the sensor officer can cloak the ship. When the ship is cloaked, no locks can be attempted, but enemy locks have a -2 to their success roll. In the action phase, the sensor officer will have 30 seconds to pull out shapes from the bag that match the target cards. If he pulls out a shape that does match one of his targets, he simply slots it in and tries again. If he pulls out a shape that does not match one of the target cards, then that target lock is failed, and he receives no sensor points for that particular attempt. Next up is the tractor beam officer. The tractor beam officer is in charge of using the tractor beam in order to deal extra damage to enemy ships and pull in crystals. It's important to note that the tractor beam officer cannot do anything without energy from engineering. The tractor beam officer at the beginning of the game receives the tractor beam board and 16 tractor beam tiles with depicting various shapes, colors, and numbers. At the beginning of the game, the board is set up randomly with all the tiles being placed face down. Then, in Phase 5, the tractor beam officer can make 1 tractor beam attempt for every energy token he has received. The tractor beam officer can dry fire the tractor beam in order to learn more about the board. It is essentially a game of memory for this officer. If the tractor beam officer has a lock or super lock on a target ship or on a target crystal, he can make a tractor beam attempt targeting that object. Again, he must spend 1 energy for the attempt and flips over 2 tiles. If the tiles match in color, number, and shape, the tractor beam officer receives a number of tractor beam points equal to the match. For instance, if he reveals 2 green 3 stars, he gains 3 tractor beam points. A number of tractor beam points are required equal to the distance from the object and the ship's current speed. So, to pull in an object that is 2 spaces away while moving 3 speed, you will need 5 tractor beam points. A super lock doubles the number of tractor beam points you receive from the attempt. Therefore, if you reveal those 2 3s, you'll get 6 points rather than 3. In addition, the tractor beam officer may make a tri-beam attempt. When he does so, he reveals 3 tiles rather than 2. If all 3 tiles match in shape, he receives points equal to the match, plus half of the points of the 3rd tile rounded up. If they do not all match in shape, the ship instead takes 1 internal damage. After the tractor beam officer does a normal or tri-beam attempt, the matched tokens are removed from the board and are not replaced until the tractor beam officer chooses to reset the entire board, replacing all tiles and having to relearn their locations. Next up is the weapons officer. The weapons officer's job is simple: fire torpedoes at enemy vessels. The weapons officer receives the torpedo track, a wooden disc representing completed torpedoes, a series of torpedo tube cards, and cardboard Tetris pieces with which to build the torpedoes. During the preparation phase, the torpedo officer receives at random 1 torpedo tube card for every energy he is given by engineering. Then, during the action stage, he will have 30 seconds to build these shapes out of the Tetris pieces. For every completed card, during Phase 6, Fire Weapons, he will be able to flick the wooden disc along the track 1 time. If the disc goes off the track, it is a complete miss. If it lands anywhere on the track, he can do an amount of damage equal to the number shown. This damage is modified by lock type and by potential tractor beam. More damage is done with a lock and a super lock than with no lock, and double damage is done if the tractor beam officer successfully did his job during this round. The weapons has a max range of 6 and you fire the disc from behind the line corresponding to the range away from the target. Finally, the weapons officer can fire seeker torpedoes. Seeker torpedoes use 2 torpedo cards, but still use only 1 energy. If both cards are completed successfully during the action stage, then you may fire a seeker torpedo. If one or both cards are not completed successfully, then you do not get a disc for that shot. When firing a seeker torpedo, you may flick the disc along the track twice. If it goes completely off track, you do not get a second flick. Otherwise, you use the second flick's landing to determine damage. Next up, we have the shields officer. The shields officer is responsible for operating the shields to prevent damage to the ship from enemy fire and obstacles. The shields officer receives the shields board and a bunch of numbered hexagons in orange and blue. In addition, the shields officer receives 1 ICE token. In the preparation stage, the shields officer takes face down a number of the hexagons depending on the number of energy he's received from the energy officer. If he receives 1 energy, he draws 6 tiles, 2 8 tiles, 3 10 tiles, and 4 12 tiles. Then he slots these tiles into the zones on the shield track. He may put 2 tiles in the center and 3 tiles on each of the sides. The 2 center tiles may not be a pair. Shield strength is calculated based on the 2 tiles in the center plus the 3 tiles on each side independently. The shields officer is essentially forming the best poker hands he can with the 2 in the center applying to all 4 sides. The shields officer can also slot the ICE token, or the isochromatic enhancer, in order to increase the shield strength on a certain side. When he does so, it counts as either orange or blue, but does not have a numerical value. The reason he would do so is because if on the outside of any shield track you have all the same color, your shield strength is doubled. On the turn after using the ICE, it freezes in place, and no token can be placed in that slot, and it does not aid in either color. Next up, we have the jump drive officer. The jump drive officer is responsible for warping the ship off the map at the end of the game. The jump drive officer receives the jump drive player board, 5 6-sided dice, and a series of jump flux cards. During phase 8, the jump drive officer has 30 seconds to attempt a jump. To attempt a jump, the officer must have received at least 1 energy from engineering. When trying to attempt a jump, the jump drive officer is either going to try to achieve 5 of a kind to jump off the map, or try to capture 1 jump flux card to make that goal easier later on. The jump drive officer will roll the 5 dice and see if he can capture any cards. If he can do so, the prerequisites are at the top. He may simply take the card and end the phase. In future turns, he'll be able to activate each of the cards he's received in order to alter his die rolls and make jumping easier. During the phase, he can spend 1 energy to re-roll any number of the dice, or he can spend an energy to gain a 30-second time extension, or any combination thereof. Finally, the jump drive officer may blink the ship. At the end of phase 8, he may take 1 previously captured jump flux card and discard it. If he does so, he can move the ship 2 spaces in any direction and alter its facing. When you do blink, you must take into account any obstacles that the ship will end on. Now I'm going to talk about damage and core breaching. When a ship sustains damage to a side that is either internal or in excess of what the shields can sustain, you must flip cards from the appropriate damage deck. The damage deck contains 3 main types of cards. Structural damage, which has no game effect. Damage to a station, which will occasionally apply ongoing effects that must be repaired. And shift change cards. When you encounter a shift change card, at least 2 players must change their seats and swap all roles they possess. When you have sustained so much damage to a side that there are no cards left in that side's deck, then you begin to core breach. You move the core breach token along the core breach track once for every time you sustain damage beyond one side's capabilities. So, the first time you take damage to a side of the ship that has no cards there, you place the marker on the 3 side. If the core breach has not been repaired yet, the marker will be on the starburst side. Otherwise, you'll keep it on the OK side. If you are currently core breaching, during phase 2, you deal out face down core breach cards to the players based on the number on the track. For instance, if you are in the 3 space, you will deal out 3 cards that must be evenly distributed among the players. Then, during phase 3, the action phase, in addition to whatever other jobs the players possess, they must try to repair the breach. If the players fail to ever repair a core breach, the ship explodes and the game ends in defeat for the players. To repair the breach, the players pass around the core repair deck. These cards match the core breach cards and must be paired up in order to move on. Once a player makes a match, then he passes the deck to the next player and he must attempt to continue to repair the breach. Next up, we have the repair officer. The repair officer's job is to try to fix the ship after it's taken damage. The repair officer receives the damage and repair board and the repair deck. The repair officer will also use a D6, which is loaned from the jump drive officer. When the ship has taken damage in excess of its shields, damage cards are flipped over and occasionally will apply ongoing effects to the ship. In this instance, the repair officer may activate in phase 9 of the turn in order to fix these stations. When the repair officer activates, he may flip the top card from the repair deck and resolve it. The repair officer does not need energy from engineering, but may use energy in order to skip repair cards. For every energy token he has received, he may skip 1 repair card. If you draw a green card like this, it is an automatic success. When you do, you automatically fix the card that you're trying to repair and discard it. In addition, the automatic success cards are removed from the game after they are used. By contrast, you might also draw an automatic failure card. In this case, 1 damage is dealt to the ship instead of 1 station being repaired. Again, you may use an energy to skip these cards. The last card type are the potential success, potential fail cards. You must decide to skip or resolve these cards before rolling the die. Then roll a d6 and either repair a station or damage 1. Now that you know how to operate all the stations on the ship, it's time to talk about the ship itself. Your ship, facing this direction, will be moving through various sectors of space and encountering a variety of obstacles. The first obstacle you can encounter is a gravity well. If you move the ship with the arrows, you gain 1 speed. If you move the ship against the arrows, you lose 1 speed. Note that any speed changes will not affect your current heading, it will only change your future speed. In addition, your ship might run into an asteroid field. When you enter an asteroid field, you roll the die. On a roll of 1 to 3, your ship takes that much damage to a random shield. On a roll of 4 to 6, your ship sustains no damage. Either way, any enemies that are at greater distance than the number rolled lose a lock on you. In addition, your ship may run into a nebula. There are several different colors of nebula, but they have no differences. When you enter a nebula, you also roll a die. On a roll of 1 to 2, you lose 1 sensor lock, which is random. If an enemy at range greater than your die roll exists, then it loses a sensor lock. Finally, your ship can encounter rifts in space. When you go through a rift, your ship receives damage equal to a roll of the die. In addition, tractor beams and weapons fire from both your ship and enemy ships cannot go through a rift. Now that you're familiar with all the elements of the board, it's time to take a look at enemy ships. The enemy ship cards have the following statistics printed on them. In green next to the arrow, you'll see the ship's speed. That's how many spaces it moves when it activates. In blue next to the pentagon is the ship's shield value. Any damage dealt to it is reduced by that number. In red next to the plus sign is the ship's health. It can receive that much damage before being destroyed. In orange next to the laser, you'll see the ship's range. That's how many spaces away the ship can fire at you. And finally, in gray, you'll see the number of damage dice the ship rolls when it attacks. In Space Cadets, enemy ships follow a preset path and will follow the same actions every turn. First, any enemy ship will try to lock on to your ship. If an enemy is not locked on, or cannot lock on this turn, it does not do anything. To lock on, the enemy ship will roll a d6. If the result is equal to or higher than the distance away from the enemy will achieve lock-on. When it does so, you flip it from the non-locked side to the locked-on side. If the enemy ship is 6 spaces away or more than 6 spaces away, after it has moved, then it loses lock and cannot regain lock until next turn. Assuming that the ship is locked onto yours, it will move up to its speed in a straight path toward your ship. If there are 2 equidistant paths, the enemy will take the path that causes it the least damage. Enemy ships receive 1 damage from asteroid spaces and 1 damage from rift spaces. This damage is not mitigated by enemy shields. The Nemesis is a unique enemy ship that will have specific rules in different scenarios. The Nemesis usually does not begin the game in play, but has a countdown in the enemy action stage. As the game progresses, the captain will move this countdown further toward the Nemesis spawning. When the countdown reaches 0, the Nemesis will come into play in the space your ship began on. The Nemesis is always locked onto your ship and cannot lose lock under normal conditions. The Nemesis also can gain or lose statistics based on the track. The Nemesis cannot be destroyed, but for every 2 points of damage you do to the Nemesis, you can move it down the track 1 space. Therefore, the Nemesis can be at the -2 or all the way up to the +3. These values alter the Nemesis's speed and weapons. Therefore, if the Nemesis is on the 3 space, it will deal +3 damage, or if it is on the -2 space, it will deal -2 damage. Same way with the speed. It'll either move an additional 3 spaces or up to 2 spaces fewer. The exact statistics for the Nemesis will be determined by the scenario. Now that you finally know how to play Space Cadets, it's time to take a look at it in our point-counterpoint review.
Because Mike and I generally agree about the game, we're going to roll to see who argues for the game and who argues against. If it's even, I'll take the pros, and if it's odd, he will.
That's right. It's a 5, so I will be telling you about how much I love this game.
And I'm going to tell you why it sucks. Well, I've taught this game a few times. It is impossible. The rulebook is terrible. The rulebook is poorly laid out, but not only that, there are so many niche rules elements to all these games that every player needs to know. Everyone at the table who's playing this game, and there can be a lot of players, needs to know all the roles, and they need to know all the little niche rules within all those roles. It makes it an impossible, terrible experience. That's all there is.
I mean, I personally just breezed right through that tutorial, but, I feel like this game has really unique gameplay. So I'm willing to, let's let go any potential difficulty you have with teaching it with, just how different it is. You have, knocking over the timer, you have, a bunch of different dexterity games, a bunch of different puzzles that you're all completing at the same time, and you're, both working together while also staying independent in your roles, which I really like. I really like the idea that you're using the Tetris pieces, or you're sensing in the bag, and I really feel like some of them are pretty evocative too. For instance, with the scanners, you're kind of reaching into the bag and kind of looking out into space with your hand in a weird sort of way, and so they kind of fit. With the torpedoes, you're flicking the disc to launch the torpedo at the enemies. Some of them are a little more abstract, but for the most part, I feel like I'm totally immersed. I feel like I'm part of a crew on a starship trying to hold this bucket of bolts together and just get home.
You mentioned torpedoes, and that's a problem because it is a dexterity game. And because it's so important, especially in the few specific missions, if you don't get somebody who's good at torpedoes, it's just going to be really inconsistent and it's going to ruin the gameplay. That one job, I think, brings it down a whole lot. The torpedoes, no good.
Yeah, I'll give you that. The job kind of breaks the mold. I mean, the rest of them you can practice and get good at. In my experience with the dexterity torpedo shots, it doesn't matter how much you do it, it's all over the place, or it's spot on depending on the player. So I will agree with that. But the game, while long, plays so fast and is so frenetic that I just, I don't get too mired in the torpedo problems. Because you have the timer constantly flipping over, constantly tracking the rolls, because everyone's, busy doing their own thing. You have the engineering guy, sending energy over while you're trying to, maintain the core breach. I feel totally engaged the whole time. So even though it's a long game, the time just flies.
Yeah, that's true. But how hard is it to win? I mean, even on the lowest setting with the beginner mission, it's just too hard. Even after you've spent all that time learning the game, even the lowest setting is just too difficult for new players to grasp. It took us, I don't know how many games, 3 games, before we started getting good enough to win. Mm-hmm. That's just a bad design.
Yeah, I mean, even on the lowest setting, it can be a little too difficult. I will give you that. But what's nice about that is that because it's so simultaneous and because you're doing all these dexterity and puzzle games, you cannot alpha game this one. I usually avoid co-op games. I actually picked this one up specifically because it avoids that problem. In a lot of co-op games, once you've played them a few times, you start to learn what the most efficient strategies are. And when you have somebody new at the table, there's a real, natural tendency to kind of guide that person and be like, really you should be making this move, or really you should move here and take this action. I think that comes up a lot in other co-op games and lowers the experience because not everybody is playing them on the same level. This one, because it's dexterity, because it's puzzles, because it's simultaneous, it really levels the field.
Well, that's our review. Now it's time we rate it. What do you think, Mike?
I enjoy the game. I will admit it's extremely difficult to teach. I didn't think I was going to get through that tutorial, folks. It's a pain, and for a game like this that relies on bringing different people in, new people in, it should, I think, be kind of a party game. And you don't want a party game with such a complex rule set. There's just too many little exemptions. The jump drive officer can't use his energy while you're core breaching. There's the whole ICE thing for the shields, the double torpedoes. There's just so many little things you have to go over. And everybody has to learn all of the roles, which means teaching it does take forever. I love the gameplay, but it's just too hard to get into. I'm going to give it a 6.
I agree about the gameplay. That hurts it for me. Not the gameplay, the learning. The learning. And the real big problem for me personally, though, is the size of the game. Because of how big the game is, and when I consider the places I play games most, it's just too big. I love the game. I think it's well designed, except with a few exceptions. And it is a great co-op game, but unfortunately I have to give it a 5 out of 10. I'd play it, but I can't buy it.
It's understandable. And how about we now break it down and really get into it?
Now it's time for the breakdown of Space Cadets. The box says that it takes 1 to 2 hours, but unless you give up or lose early, it's going to take 2 or more. And that doesn't include the time it takes to teach, so we give it a 10 short and 90 long. However, the gameplay is really quick, especially because of the time turns. It earns a perfect 100 fast. It plays out like a party game, so the people at the table may or may not have the skill set required to excel. It gets a 50-50 split for luck and skill. There's a little bit of strategy with the discussion around how you reroute power, but the minigames all play out and resolve in one turn, so we give it 25 strategy, 75 tactics. It's a co-op game. Everyone at the table is playing toward the same goal, but everyone has separate tasks. So it's an even split for interaction and independence at 50-50. If you're playing the game at all, it feels like you're part of the same crew working under the same captain. But some of those mini-games can be pretty abstract and pull you out of that feeling, so it earns 75 immersion, 20 abstraction. If you're playing this game at all, you feel like you're part of the same crew working under the same captain. But some of those mini games can be pretty abstract and pull you out of that feeling. So it earns 75 immersion, 25 abstraction. Space Cadets is difficult to teach. Once everyone understands the game, it's fairly straightforward and easy to play. The additional missions don't make it any harder to understand, just harder to complete. We give it 25 simplicity and 75 complexity. We give it a portability of 20 and grandeur of 80 because it has a roughly average sized box, but it takes up an immense amount of table space. There's not much that wants or needs expanding in the game, but there's a promo box you can get that expands the content, so we give it a 90 completeness and 10 expandability. It gets 5 trophies for originality because it basically reinvents the co-op genre. It'll be interesting to see if anybody can meet that challenge. We give it 2 trophies in value because for the price, it should probably be more than paper and cardboard. Mike gave it a 7 out of 10 and Tom gave it a 5 out of 10. And that is the breakdown for Space Cadets.
We hope you enjoyed learning Space Cadets as much as I enjoyed teaching it. Next week, in the Chit Chat, we'll be doing the first part of a 2-part series on the breakdown. We'll be looking at some elements in a little more detail. Next week specifically, we'll be going over immersion and abstraction and strategy and tactics. Next week's game is Hey, That's My Fish.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel for regular updates. See the links below for our Facebook and Twitter pages, and leave us a comment.
See you next week.
Virgio.
Sounds like a great D&D character.
We're like a busy illusionist.
I'm a Virgio!